Jamie Penich was born in 1979 in the small town of Derry, Pennsylvania. She was the middle of three sisters, sandwiched between Janelle and Amanda. Jamie was very close to her family, and many people said she was the spitting image of her mother, with chestnut brown hair and bright eyes. She stood at 5'2" and was full of spirit. Like her mother, she also had an adventurous spirit and inquisitive mind. Growing up, Jamie did everything she possibly could achieve. She played tennis, swam competitively, spent time on the debate team, and volunteered for the Special Olympics. But her one true passion was her deep-rooted love for exploring. As a child, Jamie pored over maps, hoping one day to travel the world. She collected globes, brochures, and even asked for a National Geographic subscription for Christmas. Her wanderlust only grew as she entered her senior year of high school, when she got the opportunity to study abroad in Belgium through a scholarship offered by the Rotary Club. She was torn, though, because her trip to Belgium for a semester came at the same time as prom, which girls in her town agreed was the only big event their school had. She didn't care much about prom, but she'd be leaving her boyfriend, Jeff Gretz, who was her world. After mulling it over with him, he told her that not going would be throwing away her dreams, and they agreed to take a break as she went to Belgium. She didn't want any ties during her trip, but she still very much was in love with Jeff, and her trip was transformative for her. She lived freely, she immersed herself in the culture, and came back with a nose piercing and a large tattoo across her back of the world map. Going to Belgium was only the beginning. Now that she had traveled, she had that itch. She wanted to see the rest of the world. After graduating high school, Jamie enrolled at the University of Pittsburgh, where she excelled. Jamie and Jeff started dating again as soon as she got back, and not long after starting university, the two got engaged. But he knew she was planning on leaving again soon. Everyone knew that going to Belgium was the best experience she had ever had, and that her dream was to travel. So when she applied to study abroad in South Korea, no one was really surprised. Just as she had before, she asked Jeff if they could just put a pause on their relationship while she studied abroad, so that she could live without the tie of home. And he agreed. Their relationship was just like that. He knew he couldn't tie her down, but he also knew that she was always his when she returned. On March 1st, 2001, Jamie stood at the airport, passport and ticket in hand, hugging her family goodbye. Patty Penich, her mother, was a big worrier. She asked Jamie to recite her itinerary one last time, then write it on a sticky note from her purse. With a final hug, Jamie boarded her international flight to Seoul, South Korea, but no one knew. When she would return to Derry, it would be in a casket. Welcome to Korean True Crime with me, your host, Mimi Mizuko. Thank you to my patrons for making this show possible. You can support Korean True Crime on Patreon today. You can also find us on Discord for occasional movie nights of films based off of real crimes. Links are in the description. All of my sources are free as well on Patreon. Warning: today's episode contains some graphic descriptions. Listener discretion is advised. Before we get into the story, the main source for today's episode is the book Murder in Room 103 by Harriet Ryan. The book narrates the story of Jamie Penich's murder through a series of interviews conducted years after the case remained unsolved. It presents multiple perspectives from people connected to the investigation or the victim, which is an insight we often lack in many Korean cases due to privacy laws. When Jamie's flight landed in Seoul, she was so excited. She had been accepted into a study abroad program at Kamyang University in Daegu, which was another 3-hour journey south by train from the Incheon airport. Kamyang is a large university home to 27,000 students at this time, but in 2001, its international student base was only 16 people. These students came from all over: the Netherlands, Finland, Russia, Germany, Japan, and the United States. Among them were the friends Jamie would come to spend most of her time with: 23-year-old Annelies Beverwijk, 22-year-old Joren Kielman from the Netherlands, 22-year-old Thomas Heikkinen, and 21-year-old Kati Peltoma from Finland, and 19-year-old Kenzie Snyder from America. I apologize if I pronounced any of those names incorrectly. I did my best. Despite their diverse origins, they found a lot of common ground being in an unfamiliar country. This happens a lot to immigrants and expats. I also found a lot of community among other immigrants when I lived in South Korea. So, the students clung together and navigated the country as a group. It also helped that most of them spoke English together, which made communicating much easier. Jamie was the unofficial leader of the group because of her brave personality. She spent her free time marveling at the market's gorgeous scenery and exploring the nooks and crannies of city life. She regularly called home to tell her parents everything she'd seen and experienced that day. On March 15, 2001, she told them she was going to visit Seoul for the first time and wasn't just sightseeing from the bus window this time. Patty was excited for her daughter, but still pretty cautious. She told her daughter not to stay in a filthy motel, but instead stay in a reputable chain hotel like a Holiday Inn. It was her motherly duty to give advice to her daughter. Regardless, Jamie agreed, knowing full well she wasn't going to spend that much money on a hotel. She felt pretty confident that she could find somewhere fine to stay for the night, since she wouldn't be doing anything at the hotel except sleeping. So what's the use in spending a bunch of money on it? The group was all trying to be frugal anyways. So together, 6 of them traveled to Seoul: Jamie, Annelies, Joren, Thomas, Kati, and Kenzie. They arrived on March 16, 2001 in the afternoon because they had classes that morning. As soon as they arrived, they stopped by a tourist help booth to get a map of the city and ask about affordable hotels in the area. The attendant suggested that they stay at the Kumsung Hotel, a low-budget option, and offered to call the motel and secure the rooms for them. They agreed because that would make renting the rooms so much easier. But what they didn't know was that motels in Korea like this are often referred to as love motels because they're rented by the hour, frequented by sex workers and clients, and often the location of illicit love affairs. They still exist in Korea to this day. I lived near one when I lived in Korea, but many of them have rebranded themselves as nicer luxury hotels because they often have jacuzzis, which are pretty hard to find anywhere else. I'll shamelessly say I have stayed in a few love motels to save money, and they're not so bad. For the students, this $15 a night was a deal. And when they went to the motel to drop off their bags, they were laughing at the condom vending machines. Together, they booked 3 rooms. Thomas and Kati, who are a couple, would stay in room 102. Jamie and Annelies claimed room 103, and Kenzie and Joren took room 104. The rooms were tiny. I mean, barely more than a bed and a nightstand, with a tiny bathroom and almost no room to move around. They also learned that this was a pretty popular motel for foreigners. Didn't matter, they were just going to get sleep there anyways. Despite this, they got some sleep and woke up early to go see Namdaemun Market. The next morning, on March 17, 2001, they spent the day seeing all of Seoul's sights. They wanted to check off their tourist brochure list of places to see. Around lunchtime, they found an Indian restaurant near their motel and met up with 25-year-old Elvira Makhmutlova, an exchange student from Russia. After some sightseeing, shopping, and exploring, they found a restaurant serving enchiladas, and as they were eating, they had a realization. It was St. Patrick's Day. The Americans wanted to start bar hopping and check out the festivities, considering they were staying in Itaewon, an area dubbed Little America due to its proximity to the Yongsan Garrison U.S. military base and the American-catered bars and restaurants. Itaewon now is nowhere near the Little America that it was then. Their destination was a pub called Nickleby's, owned by a British man named Nick Elby, which was serving pictures of green beers and blasting America's top 40 hits. To set the scene, the top hits would have been Shaggy's song Angel or Lenny Kravitz's Again. They arrived close to 10:30 p.m. to find that the bar was very popular, and this Saturday it was packed. The bar, although no longer there, had a lot of art referencing Charles Dickens' Nicholas Nickleby and was on the second floor above some clothing stores and a lotto. That night, soldiers were chugging beers, expats were mingling, and the locals came to experience the fun. For Jamie and Kenzie, they were having the time of their lives. They flirted, they were kissing a few soldiers, they drank a few too many Shamrock Green beers. Jamie even gave out her phone number to one of the GIs before the two girls decided it was time to go back to the motel. The soldiers tried to entice them to stay out longer, come to a nightclub called Stompers with them, but the girls said no thanks because they had to wake up early the next day to go sightseeing. They left sometime between 2 or 3 a.m. Jamie was pretty heavily intoxicated and needed Kenzie to help steady her on her feet for the walk back, which was a little bit of a maze. But after winding through Hooker Hill, an area notorious for its sex work business, they spotted the motel's familiar sign. I understand that saying hooker is not the respectful terminology for any kind of sex work, but it actually is called Hooker Hill at this time because each building was a short, room-sized establishment decorated colorfully with red lights outside, and they each had interesting names like Eve, Venus, Debut, Cheers, Texas Club, Tiger Tavern, and so on. The remnants of these buildings you can still find in Itaewon, but largely most of these buildings were abandoned after the 2018 Olympics, when the government started mass cracking down on sex work to quote-unquote clean up the city. But before then, sex work was largely ignored. Women stood in windows on these streets dancing to entice customers in. It was quite literally Korea's red light district. But now, sex workers bring in customers into business rooms or juicy bars where the sex work is more hidden. But it didn't really ever leave this area. So the exchange students were staying in an area really well known for partying and having a good time. But it was still relatively safe for tourists because it was known for its largely U.S. military customer base. Back at the Kumsang Hotel, everyone else was already asleep. Kenzie helped Jamie into her room, where they found the door had been left propped open. Analush had propped the door open by turning the lock with the door open, which kept it open just a nudge so Jamie could still get in. She knew that she probably wouldn't wake up if Jamie came back and knocked. As soon as the two girls got in, Jamie, slurring her words, said a shower would probably sober her up and convinced Kenzie to help her get into the shower. The bathroom was barely large enough for one of them, let alone two drunk women. Kenzie helped her inside, helped her peel off her shirt and pants, and turned on the water. Once Jamie was in the bathroom, Kenzie decided to go to sleep in her room next door, room 104, where she was staying with Yoren, who was already fast asleep. She got into bed still wearing the same clothes she wore out and tried to get some shut-eye. But after a few minutes, she felt concerned. Jamie was really drunk, and she left her in the shower. She felt like she needed to go check on her. Something felt off, but she just needed to make sure she was okay. So she trudged back to room 103, knocked, called out to Jamie, "Hey, are you okay?" She heard a very quiet yes from within. That's all she needed. Kenzie fell fast asleep, but Kati in room 104 woke up. She woke up hearing a man shouting in English. At first, she didn't know what she heard, but then she heard it again. The man spoke in an American accent and said, "But you are here now." He sounded incredibly angry, and it scared Kati. That kind of scared, where you're staring into the darkness like you'll make out something in the blackness, your ears trying to hear anything. She checked the time and it was 4 a.m. Just when she tried to go back to sleep, she started to hear this stomping sound, accompanied by a low grunting, like someone kicking the floor and grunting with each hit. It might be the sounds of some rough adult activities, but her gut told her that that wasn't right. This sounded wrong. Kati's room shared a wall with room 103. The beds were both touching the same wall. 103 was the room where Jamie and Analush were staying. But in that half-asleep grogginess, she didn't think of that. Why would she be hearing an unknown man's voice shouting from her friend's room? The stomping continued for a few minutes. It scared her so much that she decided to shake her boyfriend Thomas awake. He didn't share her concern, rolled over grumbling, just ignore it. But she was having too much anxiety to go back to sleep now, so she kept listening. As soon as the stomping sound stopped, a different man's voice said, "Let's go." A door in the hallway slammed, and she listened as 2 sets of footsteps stomped down the hallway. Kati then heard another sound coming from the room next door. She strained to hear it. It sounded like a faint tapping on the wall with a moan or a cry. This was terrifying. So she shook Thomas awake again, making sure he actually woke up this time. He listened for the sound, but said, "It's probably nothing." She tried to calm herself by agreeing with him that it was probably nothing. And even if it was, would she be able to get help when she doesn't even speak Korean? So she closed her eyes and went back to sleep. In the morning, it was a cold and gray day. Not the kind of weather they were hoping for since they'd be spending most of the day outside. And at around 8 a.m., a piercing scream woke everyone in the motel. Analush runs out of room 103, tears streaming down her face, banging on room 102 and 104 to wake up her friends. "There's a dead body in my room," she was shouting. The others stumbled out of the rooms, not really awake enough to grasp what they'd heard. She continued to yell at them. "There is a dead body and I can't find Jamie." Yoran and Kenzie sprinted to room 103 to find a woman's naked body sprawled out on the floor between the bathroom and the bedroom. Her arms were outstretched, legs splayed open, and a black jacket was draped over her face. The only thing they could see was the woman's jaw, which was bloodied and swollen. The woman's jaw hung very unnaturally, clearly broken, with teeth missing. Unimaginable violence had happened to this woman. They were stunned. Was this Jamie? They just couldn't tell by looking at her, but they knew. They just really didn't want it to be her. Mr. Shin, the motel manager, called the police that a woman was found dead. A few officers arrived to the scene, not knowing that they were walking into a murder case that would take years. The police immediately moved the huddled exchange students into room 102 away from the crime scene. One of the officers, who spoke some English, pointed towards room 103 and asked, "Who?" They all knew it had to be Jamie. The officer asked, using gestures, if any of them could identify the body. One of them volunteered, but records don't say who. But the student who did go in saw her world map tattoo and confirmed, yes, that was Jamie laying on the floor. When the student returned and confirmed it to everyone, they all started sobbing uncontrollably. They turned to Analush asking, "What happened?" Analush was in shock. She told them she went to sleep, and when she woke up just minutes prior to 8 a.m., Jamie was there dead on the floor. Kenzie offered up that Jamie was fine when she left her the night prior in the shower. Just nothing made sense. Before they could all keep talking to one another about what happened, Kenzie said she was going to call the American Embassy. She found the number in a Lonely Planet guidebook, and as soon as they picked up, she told them, "I'm an American. There's been a murder. Can you please come help us?" The other students started looking for another phone to call the university for help, but they're stopped by officers in the hallway. One of the senior officers had arrived and was furious with them. He came in, hung up Kenzie's phone, told them all to get up, abandon their belongings, and get into the police van outside. In 2001, South Korea's approach to homicide investigations was still pretty rudimentary compared to Western standards. Seoul, which had about 10 million people, reported only 163 murders the previous year, which a similarly sized city, Los Angeles, had over 1,000 homicides. Because homicide was more rare, dedicated forensic teams weren't a thing, and officers lacked training and evidence preservation. When the police arrived at room 103 and started collecting evidence, their inexperience really showed. They lifted up the jacket from Jamie's face, tossed it into a pile of her clothes and bed sheets with no consideration for contamination. Gloveless and without shoe covers, they walked throughout the crime scene, touching everything. This included the mortuary technician who arrived and tracked bloody prints through the room. The mortuary technician flipped over her body for photos and bagged evidence together in large bags. The officers at the scene didn't even have a camera with them, but the mortuary technician had this small disposable one that they used. This chaotic mishandling of the crime scene would be the foundation of the official crime scene record, which was a terrible start to this case. The officers spoke to the motel manager, Mr. Shin, who said that he was sitting at the front desk overnight watching music videos. He had heard some loud stomping coming from the first floor hallway, and he leaned over his counter to look through the clear safety glass which separated him from the lobby. He had seen a Caucasian man around 5'7" walking down the hallway wearing a dark jacket. He also had beige pants that had blood on the right side. He said he didn't call the police because, being in the red light district and all, they often saw a lot of illegal activities. A lot of trouble comes through their doors. But that was all he would tell them. The crime scene itself, in the room, was an extremely claustrophobic 11 by 8 foot space containing a full-sized bed, a side table, and a bathroom. To paint a picture, Jamie's body was laying 4 feet inside the room, parallel to the bed. Her arms and torso were on the carpet, but her legs were inside the bathroom. The room was a mess. Jamie and Analush had poured their bags on the ground before they went out. Their clothes, shoes, and toiletries were all over the floor, some splattered with blood. Across the room, they found one of Jamie's teeth, which had flown across the room in the attack. A bloody cloth was found next to her body, and a semicircle bloodstain was on the wall next to her right hand, where likely she was hitting the wall for help before her death. In the bathroom, her clothes from the night before were on the ground near the tub, next to an empty plastic shopping bag. The majority of the blood was under Jamie's body near her head. A bloody print was found near the entrance to the room, but the officers didn't have any way to preserve this mark, so they took a piece of printer paper and placed it over the print to make an impression of it. It wasn't very clear, but it was what they did. The officers inspected the hallway, which led to the lobby, and found that there was a dried, bloody handprint smear on the exit door's push handle. They swabbed the door and put it with the rest of the evidence. Since they didn't have a forensics team, they would need to send this into the National Forensics Laboratory. They had collected more than 100 items at the crime scene, 63 of which were blood samples, hairs, pubic hairs, and cigarette butts. But the evidence arrived compromised from the students entering the room, Analush touching the body, and the officers and mortuary technician mishandling everything. Worse, Jamie's body was wrapped in the bedsheet, moved to another room while they collected evidence, and then inspected on the bed before being wrapped again in the sheet, put into a car, and then transported to the pathologist still in the bedsheet. At the crime scene, the mortuary technician had noted that on Jamie's chest, there was a wet spot that appeared to be saliva pooled on her sternum. This was potentially a very key piece of evidence and was mostly rubbed off by the sheet in the transport of her body. The saliva was so contaminated that it couldn't be tested accurately for DNA. The blood on the exit door had offered some hope because they thought maybe the killer's sweat had mixed in with the blood and could offer some DNA. But if they processed the blood for a full DNA profile, it would also destroy the sample. So instead, they decided to test it for blood type. They found that the blood wasn't Jamie's at all and was likely older than a day. This led the forensics team to believe that the small amount of blood on the exit door was probably unrelated to this case entirely. Because even the National Forensics Lab lacked the ability to test the evidence without destroying the samples, it meant that most of the collected hairs and blood samples went untested for DNA. However, they also had their hands tied. The officers greatly contaminated the evidence, leaving very little for the forensics team to even work with. Jamie's autopsy was performed by Dr. Yang Kyung-moo, a lead pathologist with more than 600 autopsies under his belt. It was difficult at first to say all that had been done to Jamie because the damage was so extensive. She was covered in bruises and blood. Her face and upper body bore the brunt of the attack as well. There were boot marks on her right cheek and chest that they believed were the cause of her death initially. She had been stomped to death. This matches the stomping sound Kati heard throughout the night. A bloody print with deep treads was found on the entrance to the room, which didn't definitively match the marks on the body, but it was similar. Because the officers and technician at the scene waltzed around without foot coverings, getting blood on their own shoes, it was difficult to compare the boot print found at the scene and on Jamie's body. Dr. Young called this one of the cruelest crimes he had ever witnessed. The autopsy began with the Korean detectives, prosecutor, and lab director observing. The prosecutor had actually been the one to order the autopsy because in Korea, detectives work underneath the prosecutor's office. Dr. Young dictated his findings to the other men. Jamie had suffered repeated blows from the boot to her left eye socket, and her right ear was nearly severed. Her jaw was fractured in 2 locations. Multiple of her teeth were broken as well. There were 3 linear bruises like stripes across her right jawline, very different from the boot marks, and a large oval-shaped bruise spanning across her back. On her thigh, there were deep bruising in the shape of fingerprints, meaning she was dragged or repositioned. The saliva that was mostly lost to the sheets was clear, which meant it wasn't from her own mouth. It was from her murderer spitting on her. Finally, Dr. Young concluded her cause of death was a blow to the windpipe, which caused blood to pool in her throat. Jamie died of choking on her own blood minutes after the attack. From her temperature, they determined her time of death was near 3 a.m., with a 3-hour margin of error. Surprisingly, she had no defensive wounds, but with her blood alcohol level at 0.11, she might have been too inebriated to react to her attacker. A rape kit showed no signs of sexual assault, though a weak semen trace on her underwear collected at the crime scene hinted at some sexual activity, but they believed this might have been from days prior to the attack due to some indicators of the age of the sample. Oddly, Anna Lucia's underwear, which was collected off of the floor near her belongings, also tested similarly, but she denied having any sexual encounters in Korea at all. She and the others also didn't think that Jamie had any sexual encounters either, considering she was engaged. Yeah, she flirted and kissed some guys at the bar, but she still considered herself taken. And later, the test they conducted was revealed as having questionable reliability. This test is notorious for coming back with a false positive for semen when certain bacteria are present or the woman has a yeast infection. Unfortunately, this test did ultimately destroy that sample, meaning the test would never be able to be conducted again. The author of today's main source, Harriet Ryan, interviewed Dr. Yang, who told her that the Korean police didn't really have a good impression of Jamie. They were confused by her. She was getting a college education at a great university, but had a large tattoo. She was staying in a seedy motel on Hooker Hill and had allegedly made out with multiple men the night before while being heavily intoxicated. When they saw her body, they presumed that she was from a bad background, was into drugs, and wasn't educated, which couldn't be farther from the truth. I've included this because it's important to know how the investigators were viewing her when they started to drag their feet in the case. The Korean police contacted Dr. Kim Hye-soo, the director of international affairs. Dr. Kim was the one charged with calling Jamie's parents to give them the bad news. Before she called the Penich family, she had to speak to the president to ask permission to relay the news. A case like this getting out could cause international scandal, but the president agreed the parents should be notified immediately. Dr. Kim recalls how terrified she was to make the call because she herself was a parent of 2 daughters and couldn't fathom losing them. Patty Penich, Jamie's mother, was the one to answer the call, even though it was the middle of the night. Dr. Kim felt like it would be best to give the news to the father, Brian Penich, rather than the mother. So when she called and Patty answered, she just kept asking for Mr. Penich, which began to worry Patty. When Patty eventually gave the phone to Brian, Dr. Kim introduced herself and gave the news. Your daughter was found dead this morning. Brian and Patty were inconsolable. They didn't know what to do and they were panicking. They didn't even have passports, so they didn't even know if they could fly to Korea. But Dr. Kim told them, you don't need to come to Korea at the moment, because Dr. Kim was planning to go to Seoul on their behalf and find out more information. She also needed to meet with all of the exchange students. The Korean police at the same time were working on involving the U.S. authorities. Under the Status of Forces Agreement, they enlisted the help of the U.S. Army's Criminal Investigation Command, or CID. Given that the victim was American, and the exchange students relayed that Jamie was last seen with an American soldier and she was found with heavy boot prints on her body, it was necessary for the U.S. Army to get involved. CID agents arrived at the Yongsan police station that first day of the investigation. They met the students at the police station who had been talking to the Korean police's few English-speaking officers. Dr. Kim also arrived to the police station later that day with prepaid phone cards and hotel information for each of them. At this point, the police had told Elvira, Yoren, Kati, and Thomas that they could leave because they hadn't seen anything and they didn't have any more information to give the police. Kati and Thomas had told the police about the sound they heard in the night, but they didn't have anything else to offer. Kenzie and Analush were held for interviews as witnesses. Kenzie, the 19-year-old from Marshall University in West Virginia, was the youngest of the group, but also the most traveled. She had lived all over the world because she was the child of a father who was in the Navy. She had a lot of experience with military guys and knew how to be respectful. She also knew that they were just doing their job by grilling them about what happened. Analush, however, didn't have experience with American military. So when the CID agents came in and started questioning them angrily, she started getting angrier and angrier. Dr. Kim saw how frustrated she was each time she came out for a break, and Dr. Kim decided to ask the Korean police, please go easy on them because they're going through something traumatic. But the Korean officers told them, we're not accusing the girls of anything. The CID agents are. The Korean agents just hoped that the killer wasn't Korean because that would be terrible PR for their country. The CID agents had then taken over the questioning and took the girls from Yongsan police station to the Yongsan U.S. military garrison. Analush was getting upset because they were scrutinizing her story because she had been asleep only a few feet from where the crime happened. She was sleeping in a bed that Jamie died next to, in the bed that someone was stomping her to death next to. She recalled waking up in the middle of the night twice. Once when the door opened, then later to a hand on her shoulder. She assumed that that was Jamie coming home and getting into bed. She told them she was a very deep sleeper. They couldn't believe that she didn't hear any of the attack when Kati could hear it from the next room. They were skeptical, so they arranged for a hypnotherapist to come in and conduct a session to try to reveal any suppressed information or maybe something she'd forgotten, but they didn't find anything from the session. But the hypnotherapist didn't believe that she was lying, so they shifted their attention to Kenzie, who was the last person to see Jamie alive. Kenzie was complying and calmly told them about their night prior. She remembered that Jamie was slow dancing with a hasher named Josh, who was about 5'8" with dirty blonde hair, typical military haircut, and he had a really big smile. A hasher, as Harriet Ryan describes, is a running club with a drinking problem. Or actually, they say a drinking club with a running problem. While Jamie danced with Josh, Kenzie was dancing with Nick, another hasher who had bought them some pitchers of the green beer. She told them he was about 5'10", Latino or maybe Hawaiian, and a medium build. As the night progressed, Jamie and Josh started kissing while Kenzie sat to talk to another soldier named Vincent. Vincent and her sat in the booth and talked about their plans for life. He said he really wanted to go see Jeju Island that summer and offered to take Kenzie with him, but she told him no, they just met. But he kept insisting until he got closer and tried to kiss her. Kenzie did not like his aggressive vibes and left the booth to return to Jamie, who was giving Josh her phone number. She bumped into Nick again, and he told her that him and the other hashers were going to move to a nightclub called Old Stomper's Rock Spot, which was owned by Canadian Dwayne Robertson until it closed in 2012. Apparently, it was a beloved club for rock bands to perform live music and was a staple for the military to gather at. Kenzie and Jamie noticed that Nickelby's was emptying out, so they probably should go back to the motel and get some sleep. She says she thinks they left at 3 or 3:15 a.m., but she didn't see the time. When they got to the motel, she looked down the alley and saw Vincent and another man walking. She waved towards them, and they waved back, then she went in the motel. When they got to room 103, that's when Jamie was insisting to take a shower, and Kenzie helped her undress. She left Jamie wearing just underwear and returned to her room. She returned later to check on her, and that's when she went to sleep. After she finished her story, she remembered Nick and Josh and a ton of people were taking photos that night. The CID agents were pleased with her level-headed recollection, and they had enough information to find the GIs that they met that night. Sergeant Joshua Harlan, a 24-year-old dental equipment repairman and hasher, admitted dancing with Jamie but said her drunkenness turned him off. He denied knowing her motel location and hadn't followed her. They tried to find out some more information about him. He was part of the hashers and had the nickname Kiwi Candy because a New Zealander friend of his said when Josh gets drunk, he takes his shirt off and likes to be eye candy for the other Kiwi girls. They searched his barracks and took DNA samples from him as well as took the clothes that he had worn that night. This was confirmed by pictures of him he had taken. Staff Sergeant Nicholas Baer, 28, an ophthalmologist assistant, was also a hasher nicknamed Pound Cake because of an embarrassing incident in which he dropped a case of beer on his crotch. Nick recalled dancing with Kenzie and Annaloosh, but not Jamie. He had noticed Vincent was pulling Kenzie away from him because he was interested in her. They took his DNA sample, searched his room, and also took the clothes he wore that night. Nick said he was out until around 6 a.m. at Old Stomper's Rock Spot, which could be confirmed by many other people there. Vincent, whose last name is unknown, was a 24-year-old second lieutenant at Camp Casey. He remembered Kenzie but not Jamie, claiming an alibi with Javier Martinez, the friend Kenzie saw him with in the alley. His alibi is that they were at Stomper's until about 5:30 a.m. Footage and witnesses supported all three of their stories for the most part, but Stomper's footage wasn't great quality. The police had their suspicions because Vincent was seen with Javier in the alley, and two men's voices were heard by Kati, but there were still doubts that it was them. First off, Vincent's size 13 boots didn't match the size of the print. Neither did Javier's size 13 boots. Vincent's height also didn't match what Mr. Shin had told the officers. The manager said he saw a man about 5'7", but Vincent was 6 foot. 5 days later, the police interviewed another man who was photographed by someone at the bar dancing with Jamie. They interviewed Michael Kalinsky, a 27-year-old infantry captain at Camp Red Cloud. He was part of the Hasher Club and had the nickname Mount Vesuvius. He said that he remembered Jamie very well because they had been kissing while dancing. But at around 1 a.m., he left Nickelby's to head to Stomper's, which he stayed at until 6 a.m. He was pretty hesitant to talk to the police about kissing Jamie because, well, Michael was married. His wife was still in America because he was lower rank, he couldn't bring her with him. To no surprise, the update for him is that his wife divorced him. That same day, the Yongsan Police Department received a phone call from a woman named Miss E. She was in her 20s, fluent enough in English from working with GIs, and she had been at the motel the night of the murder. Miss E worked at a tourism company in the area and liked to spend time with the soldiers on the weekends. At around 4:20 a.m., she had come into the hotel with a GI. She had come from Stomper's, where most of the soldiers ended their night on the weekends. When they came in, she noted the time on the clock above the check-in desk and saw the manager was standing in the lobby. The manager gave them a snarky comment and said they were fully booked for the night, but her date already had keys to a booked room. They were staying in room 213. She made her way to the second-floor stairwell, and as she did, she passed a man standing outside of room 103. This wouldn't have stuck out for her, except the door was slightly ajar, which curiosity made her peer inside. She couldn't see inside, but the man outside the room was looking around like he was waiting for something or someone. He didn't look Korean, but his skin was tan. She thought maybe he was mixed or from South Asia. He was somewhere between 5'7" and 5'9" and was wearing dark-colored pants and a long-sleeve shirt, bright-colored. As she passed him, she glanced back for a moment and he had started pacing in front of the door. As soon as they opened the door to the stairwell, her and her date heard the manager begin to yell at the man in the hallway, which made the man grab the door handle to room 103 and go inside. Miss E was shown pictures of the soldiers who had been at the bar that night. She sorted through them and then stopped on one of the pictures. A picture of a racially ambiguous man, Staff Sergeant Nicholas Baer. She hadn't lingered on the man's face for very long that night, so she couldn't be certain that this was him, but he closely resembled what she remembered. To help her remember, they brought in the hypnotherapist who helped her try to regain some of the details from her memory. However, the hypnotherapist stated that because the police had already shown her the photos of the men at the bar, She now subconsciously was more likely to imagine the man she just saw in the picture than the man from her actual memory. Regardless, they proceeded with knowing it might not produce anything. She stated that she thought she remembered his shirt being brightly colored, but realized no, it had horizontal stripes around the chest. And she remembered more about the manager. She said the manager was a short woman who had yelled at the man for loitering in the hallway. The police were stunned, but Mr. Shin was the one who was there that night. He said his wife had been home that evening. What reason did Miss E have to lie about the manager's wife being present? She didn't have a reason to. The police brought Mr. Shin and his wife back in to revisit their statements, confronting them with what Miss E had said. Mr. Shin had told them that he was there that night and that he had seen a man wearing bloody khaki pants leaving the motel. He also told the police not to interview his wife because she was sensitive and that she wasn't even there that evening. So the officers confronted him about this discrepancy. He came clean immediately. He said, yeah, he changed a few details because his wife is mentally ill and he wanted to prevent her from getting overwhelmed by being interrogated. His wife had told him what had happened that evening, and he decided to pretend that it was actually him that was there that night so that he could be interviewed. In reality, his wife, Mrs. Bach, was alone at the motel that night. At 3:30 a.m., she had walked out from behind the check-in desk into the lobby. She was waiting for her husband to get home, and she was upset that he was late. As she was waiting, she heard a door slam and saw a Caucasian man leaving room 103 wearing bloody khaki pants that were soaked in blood at the ankles. She said he was so frightening she didn't want to even confront him. So she tried to get a good look at him and hid behind the desk. He was around 5'8" or 5'10", a little bit chubby, and he wore a light-colored jacket with a checkered pattern shirt underneath with brown hiking boots, like the ones a soldier would have. She said if she saw him again, she would recognize him because he scared her so much. She added that she didn't yell at anyone loitering that night in the hallway and didn't see Miss E or her date, so she had no clue who Miss E was. The police had 2 witnesses that appeared to both be hiding information or lying about details. So they asked Miss Pak about the exchange students, which Anna Lush had told the police when they got in earlier that night. She had asked the woman at the front desk for water, but the woman ignored them. Mrs. Pak denied ever seeing Anna Lush. It's just so odd. Why lie about small details? At this point, nobody's story fit perfectly with the others. No one's time frame was the same. No one saw a similar looking person in the hotel. Everyone was saying they came in at different times. Why was everyone lying about something? Mrs. Pak and Mr. Shin had an adult son who lived in Itaewon. The police started implying that they might be covering up for their own son. The implication was that because their son lived in Itaewon near Hooker Hill, he might be gay, someone who frequented sex workers, or was someone who was anti-American. They were just throwing out insults hoping one of them would stick. It's just interesting that the police thought that being gay, enjoying sex workers, or participating in anti-American protests would lead to them murdering a woman. A lot of shame and stigma there. Regardless, it was clear the couple was hiding something they knew. I really wish they investigated this lead further, but Mr. Shin and Mrs. Pak stuck to their story from then on. Based on Missy's testimony, they were looking for 2 men who they believed to be Nick Baer and Michael Kalinsky. The 2 men didn't have alibis for the majority of the night, and they both matched the clothes of the men seen. Nick was wearing khaki pants that night, had tan skin like the man in the hallway. Michael also wore a 9.5 boot, which was the same size as the boot prints found in the room. Their whereabouts now had to be verified. Both of the men went to Stompers, which the camera quality was not great because it's a dark, grungy type of rock bar. That night, they were all celebrating the leader of the Hashers' birthday, a New Zealand woman named Natalie Langley, who was 20 that night. She was also a preschool teacher. The other Hashers there couldn't be sure that they saw the 2 men the entire night. Nick's best friend, who had also been there, said he seemed like his normal self when they walked back to the base at the end of the night. Because Miss E had identified Nick from the photos, they decided to get a more accurate identification by creating a lineup of all of the men they could get from that night. Mrs. Bach came in to identify the man she saw in the hallway. The lineup included Javier, Vincent, Michael, and Nick. After they walked face to face with each of them, peering at them closely, she told the police, "No, I don't see the man from that night." This shocked them because now they truly had no leads on suspects. A sketch artist was brought in to make a poster fitting her description, but her description fit like every fourth GI out in Itaewon. Military haircut, clean shaven, little bit chubby, medium build with tan skin. It was very generic. No specific face details. On the military base, Nick returned and spoke to a journalist from the Stars and Stripes, which is an independent military newspaper that was the main source of information regarding the case for most people. Nick Baer spoke anonymously, but it was quite obvious that it was him. He said that it was upsetting that he was a suspect because he wasn't even interested in Jamie. He thought Analush was the cute one. No matter how suspicious Nick was being, his clothes and shoes didn't have any DNA on them. Unless he owned a second pair of boots and khaki pants to hand over, he wasn't the killer. I did notice that Miss E had seen a man matching Nick in the hallway, and Mrs. Pak saw a Caucasian man with bloody pants. Wouldn't it be more likely that Nick had accompanied the man who was the killer rather than be the killer himself? He fits the description of the loiterer, not the man with the bloody pants. Nick could just be covering up for whoever was in the room with Jamie. He did say he found Analush more attractive, which some believe that Analush may have been hurt that night and was threatened to stay silent. However, there just isn't any evidence to support this theory. The Stars and Stripes started writing that the case was being mishandled by Korean investigators because there just wasn't much hope in Korean police by locals or foreigners. In fact, to match the boot prints that they found in the room that night, they just took photocopies of the imprint that they made and had officers go around Itaewon to shoe stores and try to match it to the treads of shoes. I should note that Stars and Stripes became the unofficial record for this case because they were the only media outlet regularly posting updates on this case. They also called out the fact that when CID agents seized the clothes of the men at the bar, it wasn't until a full week later. The sketch wasn't even plastered around Itaewon until a month after the murder, when most people had forgotten what they had even done on St. Patrick's Day. It had been so long, it's unlikely anyone would have remembered seeing a man like that from such a vague sketch. In the meantime, Dr. Kim from International Affairs was helping the exchange students at Keimyung University. She had asked the university to hold a memorial service for Jamie, but they said no, because it was against school policy since the Gwangju uprising. They were worried that it might upset students and cause unrest. The students didn't care, however, so they held their own private memorial in the dormitory, putting her photo in the middle of the room and placing flowers all around it. Analush and Yoren were so distraught by what had happened, they decided to just leave Korea immediately. Analush was under no obligation to stay because she was not formally a suspect, so she left. Kenzie also decided to return to America after her interviews were finished, and she stayed with her brothers. Back in America, Jamie's family was trying to hold a funeral for her, but as they would learn, it would cost $8,000 to have Jamie's body flown back to America. And unless that $8,000 was paid, the Korean government would just let her body stay in the morgue. Her parents couldn't afford this. With inflation, that's roughly $15,000. They started to try to fundraise at their church, but Dr. Yukis, the study abroad program coordinator, contacted the family and told them they will take care of the cost. And a week later, March 25th, 2001, Jamie's body was back in Pennsylvania. Jamie's sister Janelle reached out to Kenzie to ask about her time in Korea. She wanted to know if Jamie was happy on her last day. Kenzie responded to her email and called Jamie's parents to tell them that Jamie really loved exploring Korea. She was having so much fun and was carefree that night. They thanked her for telling them that and then held the funeral at St. Martin's Catholic Church Cemetery in Derry, Pennsylvania. If you would like to leave a kind message or flowers for her grave, I will put a link in my sources for her Find a Grave page. About a month later, following a memorial that the family held on April 27, 2001, Jeff Getz, the fiancé, reached out to Kenzie to ask about her final days as well. The family had been talking to him about the semen detected in her underwear and how upset they were that Jamie was being made out to be this heavy drinking party girl who just made out with a bunch of men. Kenzie told him that she didn't really know anything about the semen in her underwear, but reassured him Jamie wasn't sleeping with anyone in Korea. They were with each other every day, all the time, and they told each other everything in their short time together. They'd really bonded. He shared with her the articles being written about the case so she could follow along too, and Jeff and Kenzie started to form some kind of friendship over their trauma. The next week, May 1st, 2001, the CID agents declared all military suspects had been cleared in the case. Frustrated, the Penich family arranged to meet with an American forensic pathologist, Cyril Wecht, on June 11th. It was a morbid day because they were supposed to be picking Jamie up from the airport that day. But instead, they're meeting with Dr. Wecht, who is known for high-profile autopsies like John Benet Ramsey and Lacey Peterson. Dr. Wecht had actually reached out to the Penich family to offer his services because he thought he might be able to get them answers. When they arrived and handed over all the autopsy paperwork that they had faxed from Korea, he told them what they feared most. The autopsy hadn't even been performed to the basic of standards. If an autopsy had been able to be redone, they likely would have been able to collect DNA that would solve the case. But Jamie was already buried. Dr. Wecht knew this case wasn't over. He advocated for the Penich family and made a call to Pennsylvania's senior senator, Arlen Specter. Dr. Wecht had met Senator Specter when they worked on the Kennedy assassination investigation together. Although they had differing opinions, they were still amicable. Senator Specter said that this call was at a good time. He was planning to visit South Korea as part of a bipartisan congressional delegation that summer with Senator Joe Biden. Yes, former President Joe Biden. They were going to China, Taiwan, and then South Korea. Senator Specter then met with President Kim Dae-jung at the Blue House and pulled him aside to ask what's going on with the stagnation of the Penich case. The president was unfamiliar with the case, but agreed that it sounded serious and necessitated a resolution. Despite the CID agents having slowed down the investigation by stopping investigation of U.S. soldiers, President Kim ordered that the investigation would resume with a new lead detective, Mark Mansfield, a relatively inexperienced and new member of the CID. It was an odd choice, but his supervisor said he showed a lot of promise. But I wonder, were they giving the case to a rookie to just say they were doing something? Or was Agent Mansfield the key to solving the murder? I hope you join us for part 2 next week. Thank you so much for listening. Join us on Discord for free movie nights, find sources on Patreon, quarterly sticker club on Patreon as well, and follow the show wherever you listen. Thank you to my patrons, Vix Mac, Lala, William White, G1 Edwards, Nico, Elijah Hancock, Anomanom, Dr. Bob, Lumos, Emma Brown, David DeFoya, Adriana, Pip, Dade512, Lisa, Caitlin, Sharon Evans, Nicey, Breaker O'Day, Kitten Who, Astabach, Quilt00, Kristen, That Lady Rach, and Amber. Dao me topayo. See you next time.